Don King built a $150 million empire and became one of the most powerful men in boxing. But behind all that success was a family story filled with arrests, addiction, and children who spent years suffering in silence. I got the details. Let me break it down. Don King's fortune is not a mystery number pulled from thin air. Multiple financial outlets, from celebrity net worth to the richest, land on the same figure. Don King has a net worth of $150 million. That's the headline. That's the empire. Decades of promoting the biggest names to ever lace up gloves. Muhammad Ali, Mike Tyson, George Foreman, Evander Holyfield, Larry Holmes, turned a man who once ran numbers on the streets of Cleveland into a boxing kingmaker with a fortune to match. His biggest success was Mike Tyson. King promoted Tyson and Evander Holyfield's infamous 1997 bout, which grossed $110 million. That's one fight, one night in a ring. And King had his hands on dozens of nights like that one across 5 decades. He promoted over 900 championship fights, and more than 100 boxers earned $1 million or more in fights his company put together. The man built an empire on the backs of the biggest punches in sports history. But here's what most of that money talk skips right past. Don King wasn't just a promoter. He was a husband and a father. And while the checks were clearing for hundreds of millions of dollars, his own children were living through a different story entirely, one that never made the highlight reels. Don King married Henrietta King back in 1959, and together they had 3 kids, Deborah, Carl, and Eric. Carl was actually Henrietta's son from her first marriage, adopted by Don, making him Eric and Deborah's half-brother. All 3 grew up inside the whirlwind of their father's rise. The fame, the fights, the cash, and eventually the lawsuits. Start with Carl. He's the one who went into the family business, working directly under his father at Don King Productions, managing fighters. And it's Carl's name that shows up again and again in court filings, not as a witness but as a defendant. Boxer Tim Witherspoon's contracts included managerial deals, with Carl King one contract for show that gave him 33% of Witherspoon's purses, and another that secretly gave him 50%, far more than boxing commissions allow. Witherspoon was promised $150,000 for a fight with Larry Holmes, but received only $52,750 because Carl King took 50% of the purse, which was illegal under Nevada rules, on top of sanctioning fees also deducted. That's Carl's name attached to a fraud claim before he'd even turned 33. Then there's Eric. While his father was closing deals worth tens of millions, Eric was fighting battles of his own in family court. After marrying Muhammad Ali's sister-in-law, Eric King was arrested and jailed in 2000 for failing to pay child support for his daughter from former girlfriend Anna Carrill. That's not a footnote. That's a King son sitting in a cell over unpaid support, while his father's company was cutting checks in the hundreds of millions. And then Deborah, the daughter who tried to walk her own path in the same industry, working as a consultant and sports manager, only to end up somewhere far darker. Deborah King struggled with drug addiction and was sentenced to 24 months of supervised probation instead of jail in August 2006, after pleading guilty to cocaine possession charges. 3 kids, 1 massive fortune sitting behind their last name, and 3 completely different roads that all led to courtrooms, custody battles, and addiction. That's the empire and the family, side by side from the very start. The rest of this story is about how that gap opened up and why it never really closed. The thing about the King name is that it opened doors and it slammed them shut at the exact same time. Carl, Eric, and Deborah didn't grow up as ordinary kids. With an ordinary dad who happened to work in sports, they grew up as extensions of a business. Carl described being overwhelmed by the daily plethora of new experiences he had, growing up around notable public figures, having followed in his father's footsteps into the family business. That's a polite way of saying he never really had a childhood separate from his father's world. His identity was tied to Don King Productions before he was even old enough to vote. And that tie-in wasn't just emotional, it was contractual. Carl wasn't just around boxing, he was placed inside boxing contracts as a manager. For fighters his father promoted, which meant every time a boxer felt cheated, Carl's name got dragged into the paperwork right alongside his father's. He didn't choose that exposure. It came bundled with being Don King's son. Deborah's story ran on a completely different track. but the pressure of the name followed her too. Deborah described being overwhelmed by the daily plethora of new experiences she had. Growing up with notable public figures, the exact same phrase her brother used, independently, about the same childhood. That's not a coincidence. That's two siblings describing the same suffocating spotlight in almost identical language, years apart, in separate interviews. So before we get into the fights, the money, and the fallout, that's the baseline. 3 kids, 1 empire, and a shared feeling that their childhood was never really their own. Now let's go back and see exactly how that empire got built, because you can't understand what it cost the kids until you understand what it took to build it in the first place. Before there was a $150 million fortune, there was a kid from Cleveland, running numbers on the street. Don King's roots trace back to the rough street corners of Cleveland, a kid dodging trouble, finding his way through illegal gambling before boxing promotion. Grabbed him by the collar. That's not a rags to riches cliché. That's the literal starting point of the man who would later control the biggest names in the heavyweight division. King's path to boxing wasn't glamorous either. He started boxing business while doing fundraising work. In 1972, for a struggling Cleveland hospital, he asked Muhammad Ali to attend a charity event and later convinced Ali and George Foreman to let him promote their 1974 heavyweight championship bout. That bout became known as the Rumble in the Jungle, and it changed everything. King's rivals all sought to promote that fight, but King was able to secure a then-record $10 million purse through an arrangement with the government of Zaire. A man with a manslaughter conviction and no formal promotional experience out-negotiated the biggest names in the business for the richest fight boxing had ever seen. That's the moment Don King stopped being a Cleveland hustler and became a global boxing power. From there, the empire snowballed. King promoted some of the most prominent names in boxing, including Muhammad Ali, George Foreman, Larry Holmes, and Mike Tyson, and he's remembered for promoting the Rumble in the Jungle and the Thrilla in Manila, 2 of the most talked about fights in the sport's history. He wasn't just promoting fights, he was manufacturing spectacles, and the world paid to watch. Then came Mike Tyson, and the money went from big to almost unbelievable. King's work with Mike Tyson in the late 1980s and 1990s brought in about $100 million. The Tyson-Holyfield rematch alone grossed over $100 million in a single night. King had built a machine that could turn punches into fortunes, and he sat at the center of every dollar. But that machine ran on more than talent and timing. It ran on control, and often on numbers that didn't add up for the fighters actually throwing the punches. Larry Holmes alleged that King cheated him out of $10 million in fight purses over the course of his career, including claiming 25% of his purses as a hidden manager. That's not a rounding error. That's a heavyweight champion of the world, saying the man promoting him quietly siphoned a quarter of his earnings, while pretending to have no managerial stake at all. Muhammad Ali, the very fighter who made King's career possible, wasn't spared either. In 1982, King was sued by Muhammad Ali for underpaying him $1.1 million for a fight with Larry Holmes. What happened next reads like something out of a mob movie rather than a boxing dispute. King called in an old friend of Ali's, Jeremiah Shabazz, handed him a suitcase containing $50,000 in cash and a letter ending Ali's lawsuit, then asked Shabazz to visit Ali, who was hospitalized with failing health, to get him to sign it and hand over the cash. Ali signed. The letter even gave King the right to promote any of Ali's future fights. Shabazz later said outright, according to reporting, that Ali was ailing by then and mumbling a lot. I guess he needed the money. Ali's own lawyer reportedly cried when he found out his client had signed away the lawsuit without telling him. This is the foundation the $150 million sits on. Not just promotional genius, though there was plenty of that, but a pattern of squeezing fighters that stretched across decades and multiple legal battles. In 2004, King settled a lawsuit with Mike Tyson for $14 million, and he'd also had legal disputes with Muhammad Ali and Tim Witherspoon. And here's the part that connects directly back to his kids. King didn't run this machine alone. Many of the deal's fighters were coerced into signing. Included managerial contracts with King's son Carl, which gave Carl as much as half the purse for each fight. That single sentence is the hinge of this entire story. The empire and the family weren't two separate storylines. Carl King was wired directly into the machine that made his father $150 million, which meant every controversy, every fraud allegation, every boxer who felt cheated came with Carl's name attached to it too. King's business interests didn't stop at boxing either. His wealth grew through other ventures too. He owned the Call and Post newspaper and organized Michael Jackson's Victory Tour. He was diversifying, building layers of income on top of the boxing promotions, all while the lawsuits kept piling up in the background like an unpaid tab. By the time King was in his 60s, he had turned himself into one of the wealthiest and most controversial figures in American sports. He'd navigated controversies, legal battles, and Senate investigations while amassing an empire built on the sweat and punches of the boxing legends he promoted. That's the empire in full. Now we need to go back to the family that lived in its shadow, starting with the son who was placed directly inside the machine. If there's one King child who got pulled hardest into his father's business and paid for it in courtrooms, it's Carl. He wasn't a bystander, watching his father's empire from a distance. He was inside it, managing fighters, signing contracts, and taking a cut of purses that boxers say they never agreed to. The Tim Witherspoon case is the clearest example of how deep Carl was pulled in. Witherspoon's $9 million lawsuit against Don King and his stepson Carl alleged that his problems began in 1982 when his management contract was sold to Don King, who then demanded Witherspoon sign an exclusive promotions contract with Don King Productions and an exclusive management contract with Carl. Witherspoon signed both. From that point on, according to the lawsuit, his career wasn't really his own. Over the following 4 years, Witherspoon alleged that Don King forced him to sign blank contracts, fight while injured, train at King's boxing camp, at costs of up to $1,000 a day, accept purses that had never been negotiated, and pay Carl up to 50% of his earnings for management services that were never rendered. Read that last part again. Services never rendered. That's the allegation that turned Carl King from a boxing manager into a defendant in federal court. The financial breakdown gets even more specific. Witherspoon was promised $150,000 for a fight with Larry Holmes, but received only $52,750 because King's son Carl took 50% of the purse, illegal under Nevada rules, on top of a WBC sanctioning fee also deducted from the total. On another fight, the numbers were even worse. Carl King again received 50% of his purse, despite Don King Promotions falsely claiming he had only been paid 33% on an HBO fight that paid King's company $1,700,000. For Witherspoon to face Frank Bruno, Witherspoon's own purse was $500,000, but he received only $90,000. $90,000 out of a fight that generated close to $2 million for the people managing him. Carl's signature was on the paperwork that made that math possible. King and Carl responded to all of this the way they always did. Don and Carl King denied every allegation in the lawsuit. Their side of the story, delivered through their attorney, was that Carl King provided legitimate management services to Witherspoon and that the fighter paid Carl a 50% management fee to repay huge sums of money that had been advanced to him. Their lawyer went further, framing the entire pattern of lawsuits as a targeting problem, rather than a fraud problem, saying plainly that Don King is a target for lawsuits. He's big and black and burly and successful, and he antagonizes a lot of people. But Witherspoon wasn't the only fighter whose contract had Carl's name stamped on it, as a built-in condition of doing business with Don King. Nearly 2 decades later, boxer Ricardo Mayorga filed his own federal lawsuit, and the same structural pattern showed up again. Mayorga alleged violations of the Muhammad Ali Boxing Reform Act, claiming King set up a conflict of interest when he made his son Carl King the manager for a fighter King himself was promoting. Same setup, different decade, different fighter, same son standing in the exact same conflict of interest position his father kept creating for him. That's worth sitting with for a second. Carl didn't design that system. His father did, but it was Carl's name on the contracts. Carl, who had to answer for the missing purse money. Carl, who became the face fighters pointed to when they felt cheated, decade after decade, fighter after fighter. He was, in a very real sense, absorbing the legal risk of his father's business model, simply by being his father's son and stepping into the role handed to him. And it never really stopped. Even fighters managed through King's company decades later found themselves in disputes with the exact same structural complaint. One fighter walked away from a bout with a check for $29,000. After Don King Promotions and his purported managers took their cut of his purse, none of whom held a manager's license at the time of the bout, leaving him with less than 10% of what the company itself had cut. The playbook King built, with his son placed inside it as manager, kept running for years. After Witherspoon and Mayorga had already sued over the identical arrangement. Through it all, Carl stayed in the business. He didn't walk away from boxing after the lawsuits, and he didn't distance himself from his father's name. Carl continued providing color commentary for domestic and international boxing broadcasts long after the Witherspoon case had wound its way through federal court. When asked about his father directly, in an unguarded moment, his answer wasn't complicated. He called him the best, bar none. That loyalty is its own kind of story. Carl was the son who got dragged into fraud lawsuits, accused of taking money for services fighters said were never rendered, and used as a legal shield for a system built by someone else. And he never once turned on the man who built that system around him. Whether that's devotion or something closer to a life with no other exit, the record doesn't say. What the record does say clearly across multiple lawsuits spanning multiple decades is that Carl King paid a price. In courtrooms, in reputation, in years of his life spent answering for money he says was managed legitimately. For being the son who said yes. If Carl's story is about being pulled into his father's business, Eric's story is about a completely different kind of fallout. One that played out not in boxing courtrooms, but in family court, over unpaid child support and a daughter who eventually wanted nothing to do with him. Eric King built a life outside the boxing business his father and brother worked in. He lives in Texas and works as a mortgage broker. On paper, that sounds like the King child who found a lane of his own, separate from the fights and the fraud allegations. But Eric's personal life turned into its own kind of public record. After marrying Muhammad Ali's sister-in-law, Eric King was arrested and jailed in 2000 for failing to pay child support for his daughter from former girlfriend Anna Kirill. That marriage only lasted a month, but Eric's child support troubles went on for a lot longer. This wasn't a one-time slip. It became a pattern that stretched across years and multiple court orders. In 2005, Eric promised the court he would keep up to date on his payments, but that promise only lasted 5 months. So in 2008, he received a court order telling him to pay $10,000 in back child support or go to jail. Think about that timeline. A promise made to a judge, broken within half a year, followed by another court intervention years later. That's not a single bad stretch. That's a recurring failure that the court system had to keep stepping in to address. There was even a dispute over whether Eric was the father at all. Eric insisted that in the 2 years of traveling together and sleeping in the same bed, as he told the New York Post, they didn't have the kind of sex that would produce a child. Paternity was tested and confirmed anyway. Paternity was established, and Eric was the father. After being jailed for his lack of payments, he paid his daughter $100,000 and was ordered to continue paying $344 a month in child support. Here's where the story gets its sharpest edge. His daughter, Natalie, grew up watching all of this play out, the denials, the court orders, the jail time, and by the time reporters asked her directly how she felt about her father, there was no ambiguity left in her answer. She told the New York Daily News plainly that he was nothing to me. He's like dirt. That's not a quote from a tabloid trying to stir controversy. That's a King granddaughter, on record, describing her relationship with her father in the coldest terms possible. Sit with the contrast for a second. Don King's company was cutting checks worth tens of millions of dollars for a single fight night. Meanwhile, his son was sitting in a jail cell over a $10,000 court order tied to child support for his own daughter. The empire's money wasn't trickling down in any way that mattered to the people actually inside King's bloodline who needed it most. And this wasn't happening in isolation from the rest of the family's turmoil. This was unfolding at the same time Carl was fighting off fraud allegations in federal court. And around the same period, Deborah's own struggles were becoming public. 3 kids, 3 separate legal battles, running on 3 parallel tracks, all while their father's name kept appearing in headlines tied to 9-figure fight purses. There's a piece of this that connects back to something bigger than any single lawsuit too. The family's foundation itself had already been shaken years earlier by something no amount of money could fix. Henrietta King, the mother of all 3 children, passed away in 2010 after a battle with stomach cancer. Whatever stability she provided as the parent managing the household, while Don King ran his empire across continents, it ended with her illness, and the children were left to navigate their own separate struggles, without the one parent who, by most accounts, held things together at home. Deborah later spoke about her mother's role directly, describing how her family stayed grounded in faith, despite the chaos surrounding her father's career. She described her family as immersed in a spiritual environment, despite the high-profile nature of her father's career and his incarceration, with her mother acting as a spiritual anchor who took her to church and instilled a strong sense of faith. That's a daughter crediting her mother, not her famous wealthy father, with whatever grounding she had growing up. Notice what's tucked into that same sentence almost as an aside: his incarceration. Don King's own prison record wasn't some distant footnote from before the kids were born. It was part of the environment his children were raised inside, a fact serious enough that his own daughter mentions it, in the same breath as describing her childhood faith. The empire and the prison sentence were both threads of the same household story. Eric's path stands as its own case study in what happens when a famous last name doesn't translate into the kind of presence a child actually needs. He wasn't fighting his father's business partners in court like Carl was. He was fighting a court system trying to hold him accountable to his own daughter, and losing that fight publicly, more than once, over a period of nearly a decade. By the time Natalie was old enough to speak for herself, the damage wasn't repairable with a check. It had already calcified into the flattest kind of rejection a child can offer a parent. That's Eric's chapter in this story. Not a fraud lawsuit, not a boxing contract, but a private family failure that became public because of the name attached to it. And it sets up the final piece of this puzzle, because Deborah's story runs on its own separate, and in some ways heavier track. Deborah King had every reason to walk a smooth path. She was the daughter, not the stepson pulled into contract disputes, not the son fighting child support orders. She built her own credentials, working as a consultant for her father's company, and later as a sports manager for boxing champions in her own right. And for a while, that path looked like it was working. But somewhere along that road, Deborah's story took its own turn into crisis. Deborah King struggled with drug addiction and was sentenced to 24 months of supervised probation instead of jail time in August 2006, after pleading guilty to cocaine possession charges. That's a daughter of one of the wealthiest men in boxing, standing in a courtroom, pleading guilty to a drug charge. The kind of headline that doesn't fit neatly next to a $150 million net worth, but belongs in the same family story, all the same. What makes Deborah's chapter different from her brother's is where she took it afterward. After a successful stint in rehab, Deborah King founded Limitless Life Recovery and Holistic Group, using her own personal battle with addiction to help others facing similar problems and get their lives back on track. She didn't just survive the crisis. She turned it into a mission, one built directly on the worst period of her own life. Her academic and professional record backs up that she wasn't coasting on her father's name to get there either. She graduated from John Jay College with a Bachelor of Arts in Criminal Justice and a minor in Forensic Science, earned a master's in Mental Health Counseling from South University, and became a certified intervention and recovery life coach. That's a woman who rebuilt a professional identity from the ground up after addiction nearly derailed her, using the very system that once processed her own guilty plea as the foundation for a new career, helping others avoid the same fall. Deborah has spoken about the specific weight of growing up as Don King's daughter in ways that echo almost exactly what her brother Carl said, word for word in separate interviews. She described being overwhelmed by the daily plethora of new experiences she had growing up with notable public figures, Two siblings describing the same childhood, using nearly identical language about being overwhelmed by a spotlight neither of them asked for. That's not a coincidence. That's a shared wound expressed independently by two people who didn't need to compare notes to land on the exact same word. She's also been direct about how her father's incarceration and his high-profile career shaped the household she grew up in, describing a family that leaned on faith to hold itself together, despite the chaos surrounding Don King's name. That framing matters, because it tells you Deborah's addiction crisis didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of a childhood that was, by her own description, defined by pressure and public scrutiny long before she ever touched cocaine. So here's where all three threads meet. Carl was pulled directly into his father's business and spent years fighting off fraud allegations tied to contracts he signed as a manager. Contracts built into a system his father designed. Eric built a life outside boxing entirely and still ended up in jail over child support, watched his own daughter grow up to call him nothing and to compare him to dirt. And Deborah, despite carving out her own professional path in the same industry, ended up in a courtroom, pleading guilty to a drug charge before turning her recovery into a second career, helping others do the same. None of that erases what Don King built. His net worth still sits at approximately $150 million as of recent estimates, and that fortune is real, tied to real fights, real purses, and a real place in boxing history that nobody can take away. He promoted the biggest names the sport has ever produced and turned himself from a Cleveland numbers runner into one of the wealthiest promoters alive. That part of the story isn't in question. But fortunes like that don't come free, even for the family standing closest to the money. Carl carries the legal weight of contracts that put his name on fraud allegations spanning multiple decades. Eric carries the record of a father-daughter relationship that broke down so completely. His own child described him in the coldest terms she could find. And Deborah carries the scars of an addiction that started somewhere inside the same household that produced a $150 million fortune. She's now spent years working to help other people survive. Don King is still out there, still connected to boxing, still the man with the electrified hair and the booming voice, who negotiated a $10 million purse out of a government in Zaire before most of his critics were even born. That's his legacy in the ring. But his children's legacy tells a different story, one that ran quietly beneath the fight cards and the pay-per-view numbers, mostly unseen, while the world was busy watching the man in the spotlight instead of the family standing just behind him. That's the full weight of the King name. A $150 million empire on one side of the ledger, and three kids who spent decades absorbing the cost of building it on the other.